Okay.
Good for you, man.
Okay, now, all right. Char Miller is the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History at Pomona College, which is in California. He is the editor of On the Border, an environmental history of San Antonio, and 50 years of the Texas Observer. He's also written several books, one about Gifford Pinchot and the making of modern environmentalism. He was the first forester, I think. Not So Golden State, Sustainability versus the California Dream. On the Edge, Water, Immigration, and Politics in the Southwest. Deep in the Heart of San Antonio, Land and Life in South Texas. San Antonio, a tricentennial history, and Public Lands, Public Debates. So we've got a lot more books of his that we can read. And it
Don't.
What?
Don't. Good enough. Stop.
Oh.
Stop.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, we all have really liked this one. So
Good.
Char used to be a professor here at Trinity. And unfortunately, we lost him to California, but we hope he comes back someday. So please, we're anxiously awaiting.
Great. So can you let me share screen so I can show some images? Do you know how to do that? If you click on the green share
Do I
screen.
have to give you permission for that? Yeah, I've
Yeah,
done
you
that
do.
before, but oh yeah, here we go. Okay.
If you click on the green share screen, it should say
Yeah, and then
multiple
I've shared.
users.
Go ahead and share.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Should be. You should be.
Perfect.
You should be able to share
Okay.
now.
Maybe because you
No.
got no. Hold on.
No. Uh-oh.
No, because I should be able to. Hold on. Let me see. Let me see.
Hang on. Let me do it again then.
Wendell, I think you're sharing your screen.
Yeah, you're sharing your screen. So don't do it. Okay, here it goes.
Okay, there you
Got
go.
it.
There you go.
There,
Got it.
yay.
There you go.
All right. Slideshow. Okay. First of all, thank you all so much for the chance to talk with you today. To Meredith, one of my former lovely and wonderful colleagues, hello. And to those who I've had a chance to work with over the years, particularly with the founding of the Sierra Club Alamo Group back in the day. It's fun to be back in touch about a city that I absolutely adore. This book, like others I've written, are really love letters to the city, critical to be sure, maybe even tough love letters. But they were all born out of an extraordinary experience for me of living in San Antonio for 26 years and not only learning how to become a teacher and a writer about a place, but also to grow up in that place, to become a much better citizen, I hope, that is committed to a community that was obviously larger than myself and much more complicated than I would have ever known when I arrived in San Antonio in 1981. But, you know, that's part of how anybody sort of makes their way into a city. And the Sierra Club is one of those institutions that allows people to and helps people come to better understand why they need to be wrestling against those economic development experts that we heard earlier, who have largely driven the economy of the city and framed it in a way that serves their interests, but does not prioritize those of folks who live on the west, south, and east sides, to be sure, because it isn't just cheap water and cheap energy, it's also cheap labor. And with that comes a series of problems that date way back into the 19th century, and with which this book is partly addressing. So let me do a couple of things as a way of and I was going to say that a brief overview, but I'm an academic and brief is a flexible term for us. Give me a microphone and this could be a long night for y'all. But to sort of talk about why I wrote the book and how that became possible, as well as to tell you something about the book itself. You know, having lived in San Antonio for more than a quarter century, One of the things that was puzzling to me in the first years when I lived there was the dam itself, Olmos Dam. I mean, extraordinary structure, although as I discovered reading through the original engineers' reports, not as quite as steady and sturdy as it had been advertised. Because it was very clear pretty quickly on that its central purpose was to protect downtown, provided no flood control for the rest of the city. And as I began to recognize this, watching floods rip through San Antonio year after year during the years that I lived there, the two blockbuster floods of '98 and 2002 were only some of many large, medium, and small ones that really sort of made it clear that we then lived in a place that the National Weather Service called Flash Flood Alley. And so part of what I wanted to do is actually to make sense of the place, to use this story of the 21 flood to help me understand why I lived in the place that I lived and why it was built the way it was built. And so the insight, if it is that, was that the 21 flood, like all floods, however ephemeral, it came racing down the creeks and the river, did the damage that it did, and then disappeared, washed its way ultimately down to the Gulf. But what it revealed, as did all of these other floods, were many of the social problems that were already there, but because like a flood which exposes weaknesses in foundations and problems in creek beds and banks and the like, it also reveals, exposes, makes plain to us the social, economic, environmental, and other kinds of injustices. And that really is what drove the book and defined the book in terms of the way I thought about it. So let me give you some of the background in a sense for how to think about the book, but also the book in San Antonio. And the first headline is Place Matters. Where a community is located matters enormously in terms of what it experiences across time. Its physical siting, the geography, the geology, and the climate are absolutely essential to every place. And those things vary, obviously, because if it's place-centered, then each place has a different set of contingencies that it must wrestle with. San Antonio's, at one level, has to do with its physical location, set within the Balcones Escarpment to its immediate north, what we now call the Hill Country, the Edwards Plateau. That's one way to think about it, sort of the north and west portion of the city. But you also have to look south and east, because any point has multiple factors that play into it. And San Antonio's happened to be that it's 150 miles from the Gulf. Why does that matter? Well, it turns out it matters because the prevailing breezes in San Antonio historically and still are from the southeast, warm air pushing off the Gulf, coming up across the coastal plain, and then they run into Balcones Escarpment and the Edwards Plateau, where they rise. And when warm air rises and hits cooler air above, it starts this process of churning. It starts to drop and then rise again. And that's why we get these extraordinary thunderstorms that, as I recall anyway, lying in bed in my home in San Antonio, it felt as if the earth was moving, and unfortunately, so was my house. And I was a little worried about that. We survived, obviously, but those storms pack so much energy, not just rain, the energy, the electric energy that explodes across the Balcones Escarpment and hammers Austin and San Marcos and New Braunfels and San Antonio and all the way north, is a really remarkable climate relationship between climate and geography. And when those rains come slanting down over the Edwards Plateau, particularly in spring, summer, and fall, landscapes that have been baked dry, that water lands and moves fast because the tilt in the geography flushes that water downstream or into things that would become streams that have cut through the escarpment and have done so for millennia. And so wisely, the Spanish decided that's exactly where they were going to point this city and locate it in a floodplain, because that was smart. And they did it for understandable reasons. For them, sedentary agriculture, the plow, was the only way by which to grow things. Had they watched the indigenous people of South Texas, they might have recognized that there were other methodologies, but they weren't interested in them except as converted individuals who would be coerced labor to run the plow, to build their acequias and the like. And so for the Spanish, as would be true for the Mexicans, as would be true for the third wave of colonial settlers from the United States, San Antonio's position was centrally located in a floodplain tucked underneath this escarpment. And so basically what we see is why the city has routinely, consistently, and enduringly flooded. So blame the Spanish if you have to, because that's who built it this way. And by the way, you could say the same thing for New Orleans, which was a Spanish platted town. At least they figured out that what would then be called the French Quarter, I'm not quite sure why, since the Spanish were there first, is the one piece of elevated land that if a lot of other parts of New Orleans flood, that part does not. And if you look at the Alamo, it too is on a site that is slightly enough elevated that the 1921 flood washed around it, but did not wash through it. So, you know, it wasn't that they were crazy about where they built stuff, unless you look at the West Side, and there they were crazy. Because that was the lowest point, ripped through by series of creeks that set up this dilemma. And so part of what this means is that the Spanish, the Mexicans, and early Americans recognized the situation. They knew they were flooding. They knew exactly why they were flooding. But they could not, because of the nature of their agriculture, move away from the very places that also brought them death. So every time a flood ripped through the city, they would rebuild it in the exact same place. The flood of 1819 tore apart the adobe city of San Antonio. Only 6 people died, which, as best we know, 6 people died, which astonishes me because that flood was every bit as big as the 21 flood. But interestingly, and this is consistent with the city's history, no sooner had that flood washed away and the city rebuilt than the memory of that flood and its implications started to disappear as well. What we can call this, because it's repeated decade after decade after decade, I don't care what flag flew over the Alamo, it was repeated endlessly, was climate denial. They knew what the pressures were. They understood the topography. They recognized that floods were a thing in a valley that was built by flood alluvial soils washing down from the Edwards Plateau. It's what made it so fertile and the agricultural so good. But they denied the climate. That is one of the lessons, it seems to me, for us, for the Sierra Club in the 21st century, is let's not make the same mistake, even though that is what we're doing by and large. Because every time there was a flood, there would be a community meeting. And every time there was a community meeting, I can tell you exactly what they said, because I've gone through the various town commission reports, and which was, let's build some kind of structure across the San Antonio River at exactly the point where the Olmos Dam was constructed. And then cooler, wiser heads said, yeah, but that would cost us money. Why would we do that? And because no one can predict a flood, the notion was, look, we're going to gamble. We're going to gamble that in the future, we can figure out a way to deal with this. We're just not going to be the ones who pay for that figuring out. So if we look at geography and climate, we get part of the story. The other part of the story is, how do people interpret what that means to them? And how does that interpretation hold fast for decades? So you can go from the 1819 flood, go through a series of the 19th century floods, look at the floods of the 1913-14 period. There were 3 major floods that tore through San Antonio. After every one of those 3, people said, we got to do something. But they didn't. So it's not like they weren't warned. It's not like one set of civil engineers who in 1919 wrote a report to the city that said, you know what, you got a flood problem. And you better do it fast because, in fact, there was this flood in 1819 that you've all forgotten about, but we figured out. And it's a century out. Like your time is running out. But of course, the city did nothing until the flood of 1921. So here's a flood basin map, effectively, that the US Army put together after the flood itself. The Army was one of the most extraordinary civil institutions, and actually military institutions, that performed admirably during the flood. They were in these waters within minutes of hearing that the city was underwater. Thousands of troops were literally raced down from Fort Sam Houston to start pulling people out of the way, to sort of help as best they could with rescue efforts. But I want you to look at the map itself. The dark sort of segment in the center is the downtown core. Fort Sam Houston is sort of to the right of the upper hand part here. So that's Government Hill, well above the floodplain. The Army is not stupid. They understand how to build and where to build and how to avoid danger. So you've got the main trunk of the San Antonio River on the right-hand side of this map. Then you've got San Pedro Creek coming from the park itself and the springs flowing down on the near west side. You've got Martinez Creek, Alazon Creek, and then Apache Creek on the far left. And Zarzamora, which they did not etch in, which is on the upper part of the Alazon Creek that figures prominently in the book. So here's what a 21 flood could look like. And it turns out it looked an awful like what the reports of 1819 said. One of the things of which was when the flood ripped down the central city, down the river, and San Pedro Creek flooded, note what happened. There was a lake. The two merged in the downtown core. So from basically the Alamo west of the cathedral was one big lake of swirling floodwaters in 1819 and in 1921. The difference was in 1819, there were about 3,000 people here. In 1921, you were talking about the largest city in the state of Texas at the time. Hence, the damage was that much more intense in 21. The loss of life was that much more intense. And the impact of the flood, therefore, in terms of the built landscape of the human geography, and the political anguish that effectively emerged in the aftermath of this flood was much greater. But I want to show you some of the images that the Army took, in part because they took them. And it's a remarkable story at one level. A guy came into my office in Trinity sometime in the 1990s, which tells you how long I've been working on this book. And gave me a report that the military had done in September, October 1921. As best I can tell, it was never shown to the city's leadership. As far as I can tell from the newspapers, it was never discussed in city council. But the military did an extraordinary job. They didn't just take these remarkable photographs. Here's the St. Mary Street Bridge. Note the kind of debris that came screaming down the San Antonio River and hit this one of 100 bridges, took it off its posts, sort of destroyed this place. I mean, look at the chair. I love this schoolroom chair. I don't know where it came from, but the specificity of objects, of tree trunks, of doors, of other material, just flushing down the river, which proved to be almost as dangerous as the water itself. And frankly, probably was more dangerous. You got hit by that tree trunk, you were dead. You got hit by that chair, good luck surviving, because you would have been knocked out or certainly disoriented and the water might have taken you away. So the debris-filled waters were churning like a mix master in some ways and just sort of rolled its way through the community and did considerable damage. Like as the best account put it, 200 cars were destroyed. And this is in a city in 1921 that didn't have that many cars, but they were simply picked up and flattened. This is the pastoral house next to St. Mary's Street Church, Catholic Church. The street pavers, which were these thick, heavy blocks of cypress. Why they didn't use macadam? Well, I can tell you why. Because cypress was cheaper than macadam. And this is a city that really much preferred not to tax itself if it could get away with it. The problem is those pavers are thick, heavy, and swollen with water. And when they were picked up and tossed into houses, blasted through the Gunther's Hotel here on the left-hand side, they proved particularly devastating. Getting hit by one of these things was a life-ending consequence. For those who know the Gunther Hotel, imagine this form of flood control because they had sort of perfected it. They had no expectation that they would ever escape floods. So instead, what they did was to have pulleys up in the ceiling in the lobby. They would drop the ropes down when floods were emerging, attach all of the furniture to them, yank them up a story and a half, because it was an atrium, and let it sit there, wait for the floodwaters to wash through and wash out, get out the shovels, get rid of the dirt, repair the rugs, do whatever you have to do to dry that out, and then drop the furniture back down. That's San Antonio flood control in 1921. Pretty ad hoc, not terribly effective, but you know, they saved the furniture. If you want to know what the military did, they pooled around this city that looks like canals, it looks like Venice, to pick up folks who were stranded, to find cadavers, to rescue people where they could, and also to prevent looting and the like. The other thing about the military's presence, and there's a whole chapter in the book about this, is the military thought of itself as sort of a neutral player, right? They were coming down to rescue people. They got lots of praise and the like, but they also got caught in a crossfire, political crossfire between the various city commissioners who thought that they could manipulate the army in various ways to serve their own political interests. Keep in mind, within hours of this flood, the city commissioners are already jockeying for whose fault this was and who they could blame and who was problematic in this case. And so when the military finally retreated back up to the base, my sense is that they were happy to sort of wash their hands of this because it was kind of a bloody and also stupid set of responses on the part of the political figures. How unlike our own time. That a disaster strikes and people might say, well, gosh, you're at fault for this thing. So some of this is about the climate denial. Some of it is just watching how people responded. And they did, you know, some of them did heroic, valiant work, and I'll talk about some of those who did. And others are, you just sort of scratch your head and think, seriously, grow up. But that's a little hard retrospectively. It's 100 years ago and, you know, they're not with us any longer. The other thing to keep in mind, and which made reconstruction, for example, of San Pedro Creek so difficult, and why San Pedro Creek was such a death machine, was the degree to which buildings had encroached upon the creek banks. There was no zoning to keep them away from the banks. They just simply created these walls, high walls. And when water is moving quickly downstream from San Pedro Creek and then entered into what is a wall of brick, and note the height of this thing. When fast moving water gets squeezed into a corridor like this, it moves up and moves faster, so that when it finally flushed out of this encroached area, it hit the community a lot harder than it would have done had these buildings been built back off that allow the water to sluice off through the sides at some level. And in the reconstruction part, the city council was desperate to take this apart and move these buildings back. But the landowners, as best I can tell, because none of these things moved until the 1940s, were not interested. Even though the army took this photograph to suggest why this was a really bad idea. So the military engineers were cueing the community about some of the dilemmas that their own built environment produced and ramified, literally ramified, the floodwaters' power. But it didn't need necessarily high walls to take out parts of the city. This is along the Alazon Creek, which rose up quickly, flash flooded through the West Side barrio, and simply shredded it, killing more than, as best I can tell, I've got 80 names. The city thought 50 had died. I found another 30 who had died. My guess is, and the police commissioners indicated as such, there were many more dead for whom there are no names. And it's a terrifying night. And I do as best I can sort of to try to capture some of that terror along Alazon, Apache, Martinez, and San Pedro Creeks, because that's where everybody died. There were 4 people who died along the San Antonio River, all of them Spanish surnamed. Virtually everybody else on the West Side who died were Spanish surnamed. And that raises a set of questions that are pretty simple to ask, like who died and why? Well, this army photograph suggests where they died. And if you could get it, zoom in closer, you would recognize the Latino population that was there searching through these creeks, looking for bodies of loved ones, looking for possessions that had disappeared in the roar, looking at, especially here where Alazon Creek, where the International and Great Northern Railroad crossed, which is now Mopac, crossed Alazon Creek. It was a bridge that was poorly designed. It basically went right across the creek. It wasn't elevated. There was no trestle that lifted it above the ground, the level of the ground. And it became the place where all of the debris coming down Alazon Creek piled up against it. And it was also the place, as these guys are pulling their way through there, where they found many of the bodies, the final resting place of a number of people, because like these materials, those bodies were captured here. And as you can see behind, the West Side was pretty devastated. There's an oil tank farm that's burning. The railroad was crippled. It would have to be rebuilt and elevated. And again, the military is taking photographs of this for lots of reasons, in part to show what damage happened in a major flood. And again, here, the Buena Vista Playground, and that is, and I'm blanking on that street, it's not San Pedro. I think it may be Flores. Just look at the place that is swept clean. The power of this water was really unbelievable. And to recognize that, you leaf through the stories that are in the text and you realize the amazing thing is that so many people managed to get out, and mostly they got out because other people helped them out. There was a hand, there was a tree, there was something that people could grab onto and helped, secure as many people as possible. So on the one hand, the flood tells one story of damage, death, disarray, and terror. The sort of second story, in effect, is rescue. So there's 2 chapters, one of which is about the military's invasion, effectively coming down in to help San Antonio restore itself. The other story is about who, including the Red Cross, was involved in the most immediate, the first 3 to 4 days of rescuing people who lost so much. And the larger story, the larger narrative has always been that the Red Cross arrived and did good work, and that's true. They set up various headquarters. They brought in professionals that had just been up at Tulsa for the race war there, who came down to San Antonio to do sort of rescue operations and logistics, and they're really, really good at the logistics. They got hundreds of tents from the US Army in Houston, were brought in to build what they thought was going to be 3 tent cities, segregated, do keep in mind, for whites, African Americans, and Latinos, but then recognized that where the damage was is in the Latino West Side neighborhoods. And so only one of them was built, this one here. And behind this young woman who is on the cover was one of the other things that the Red Cross developed in collaboration with the US Army. They were Meals on Wheels. They rolled cook wagons down, trucks, to create, build, make food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the first 3 days post-flood. And it's to those sites that this girl and her peers, noticed here on the left, would come every day for food. But they didn't just go here. And I don't have any pictures to show this, but there was a second organization, a West Side organization called Cruz Azul, the Blue Cross, which was a nonprofit organization, a grassroots organization with ties to the Mexican government, which gave them money in the midst of the flood to do the work that they did. And what they did was set up food kitchens as well. They collaborated with West Side doctors to come give medical aid. They gathered food, clothing, built houses, did all sorts of work that ultimately they were so successful in large part because they were from the very community that was damaged, that the Red Cross conceded to them all of the food work that would be done. And they stayed on the ground for 2 months. The Red Cross left before that point. Cruz Azul was on the ground, as were other mutual aid societies from the West Side. And so part of what I was able to do was to recover this local response to this local damage that amplified the voices, the work, and the efforts of Cruz Azul and its peers, because it wasn't just outsiders like the Red Cross. It was not just the local chapter of the Red Cross that was dominated by white philanthropists who did this work. It was actually folks on the ground on the West Side that provided the biggest amount of succor and help and salvation to its own community. And that's important because the Red Cross National Office, in its incredible communication with its own staff on the ground, revealed something about philanthropy in San Antonio that I had no idea was true. And I was able to find these letters in the National Archives, and these letters are eye-popping in their revelations about the racism of the local chapter of the Red Cross. They raised money, they brought food, but the way in which they described this girl and others like them is kind of appalling. Among other things, they argued that the shacks that people had lived in, that slumlords had earned great amount of money before the flood in, should simply be replicated. And the Red Cross said, absolutely not. You're not using our money to rebuild those shanties for those who lived here. There was a big contretemps between the national and local chapter on this basis. And the national chapter proved itself, in part because of the good work it had done at Tulsa, to be resistant to the appeals of sort of white superiority, and suggested that, in fact, as one of its workers wrote a beautiful article about, look, the flood has wiped out this horrible housing. It's now time for the city to up the ante, to build real houses for people who are impoverished in this community that are being exploited by both landlords and those who hired them. But that was not to be. So the Red Cross National comes out looking so much better than the local chapter, despite the fact that they also did good work. They raised money, they brought food, they brought clothing, but they also demonstrated that came coated with the what do we call this? The sort of gap between the rich and the poor. And in this case, it was a gap that was also racial in its orientation. That gap also determined why the Olmos Dam was done and why nothing happened on the West Side until the 1960s and the 1970s. So if we think about flood control and the immediate response in 1921, which is unlike anything that happened in the preceding floods, the conversation only revolved around this dam. There were gestures to the West Side. Somehow we've got to figure out what to do for the West Side. Maybe we can clear the creeks and the like. But when it came time to do a flood bond that the city would float and the community would support, what that community supported was this structure, a $4+ million dam that I spent a lot of time because I found the engineer reports, they're very critical engineering reports after its construction, which suggested in a lot of different ways, they built it really badly. So the city is damn lucky that in 1935 and 1946, and in the floods in the 50s and early 60s, this dam did not get overtopped, because if it had, it would have torn through downtown in a way that would have been devastating. And because its bones were weak, it was wrongly built as engineers. Two different sets of engineers excoriated the original design of this dam for not anchoring it into the ground, to the earth and the rocks that lie beneath it. All sorts of things were problematic about it, but it was built. What never happened, or little happened, was anything on the west side. That would take 4 decades to emerge. But part of what the dam did was multiform. So for those of you who know the dam and who doesn't in San Antonio, you know on where that tower is, and Meredith will recognize it because the tower is over Trinity University, is a new neighborhood called Olmos Park, or what would be called Olmos Park. On this side of the photograph in the foreground is Alamo Heights, that ties into the 2 high points along this corridor through which the Olmos Creek San Antonio River flowed. So it's going to do good work. I don't mean to dismiss the dam and its role in protecting downtown, but it also, by its very presence, created a conduit that would connect Alamo Heights with a brand new suburban area known as Olmos Park, which, and as having lived in Olmos Park, not knowing much about the story when we bought our house there, one of the things that we discovered in our mortgage papers was the original covenant that these images and who they were pitched to revealed. Only white people could live in Olmos Park according to the covenant. If you were Black, Negro, or Mexican-American, Mexican, you could not live in Olmos Park. You could work there, but you could not live there. And you could hold, and it's quite specific, you could hold the job of a chauffeur, you could be a gardener, you could be a cook, you could be a maid. So already the covenant determines power dynamics inside the households of this place that is elevated above the floodplain, that, as you can see in the bottom right-hand side of this first place, argues that only houses worth more than $15,000 and up to $50,000, which in 1921 dollars, just do the math, they're expensive homes. In a city that is so impoverished, it's not just the price of the house, it's also the gap between that house and a $250 shack on the west side that tells us something about the elevated position of those who would come to this community that would be built in the aftermath of the 21 flood. But go downstream. The dam also facilitated the reemergence of an idea that had been around since the late 19th century of turning the Great Bend, what we now call the Riverwalk, into something we now call the Riverwalk. Because the dam allows you now to control floodwaters, which means you can do as R.H.H. Hugman designed it in 1929. You could seal off the Great Bend, right? You could cut it off as it is currently. You can drop things down that shut that river off. And then along the bend, create what he called wonderfully the shops of Aragon and Romula, faint bows to Spain and Star Trek. Seriously. And those shops, and ultimately the hotels that would bring the lodgers who would be flushed down to that subsection of the city, would create one of the great tourist destinations, one of the great pedestrian byways in the United States. There's no place that actually compares to the Riverwalk, in part because you can do one thing with the Riverwalk that it's really hard to do with the Seine or the Hudson River, which is actually see people on the other side. That visual connection, and that you can have these beautiful little bridges that take you over it, means that this region as it would be developed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and obviously now ad nauseum upstream and downstream, meant that you had a very visual pedestrian walkway that is incredibly attractive. So the dam creates suburban housing above the floodplain. It creates this economic boondoggle that wouldn't actually happen until the 60s and with Hemisphere, but nonetheless, it was laid out then. And it did a third thing at the street level of downtown San Antonio. It created skyscrapers. Why? Because venture capital now would be pouring into San Antonio to build the Tower Young building, the Tower Life building, as it's known now. One of the tallest buildings in the state of Texas once it was completed. It would build the Emily Morgan Hotel. It would build the Alamo Bank. It would build virtually every tall building that between 1920 and 1932, when the Depression stopped most building. So if you walk through the downtown and go, well, that's an old building, I can guarantee you that was a building that came after the flood and after the dam. And I do in one of the chapters, I sort of detail how the downtown core was fundamentally altered in a way that changed how people worked, where they worked, how they commuted to these buildings by car on new roads that are widened and sort of ended up, going to Olmos Park, Alamo Heights, Monte Vista, and the like. The middle class fled the downtown core and its neighborhoods for higher ground because they could financially, and also because they had cars that would allow them to roll down. So if we think about suburbanization of San Antonio, we tend to think about post-World War II and freeways and all of that. It's the flood of 21 that gives it the huge boom. And there were articles about that in the day that sort of laid this out. And so the flood really is this gigantic transformation of the community as it understood itself. And because skylines were now the mark of a modern city, by God, San Antonio was going to pump as many tall buildings up as it possibly could do during the decade in which it was able to do that. In fact, some of these started going up before the dam was completed because they knew the dam would soon be completed and that would protect investment capital. But walk less than a mile from this building west. And what you found was a series of shacks and shanties, in this case, one on Alazon, on Apache Creek. A photograph taken by Russell Lee, who was a New Deal photographer, who was one of these very lucky photographers who was given a job to go around and take photographs of how the Depression was, how people were dealing with the Depression. And one day he snapped this photograph with no caption whatsoever, but I will project what I think he was talking about. So he's standing on the banks of the Apache Creek, one of the blockbuster corridors of the 1921 flood. He comes upon a shack, one of many that were still on that corridor. They were supposed to be wiped out, but they were not because the city didn't give a damn. In the middle ground is Old San Fernando Cemetery, where virtually all of the flood victims of 1921 were buried. And I was in town in November for a West Side symposium. And one of the things we did was to go to this cemetery. And you can't find many of the graves because most of them were not stone, but we did find some to memorialize those who died. And go to the background. It's a mile and a quarter away, maybe a little more. There's the Tower Life building. There's the Alamo Bank. In the deep background, you can see the Emily Morgan Hotel, all of which were funded by local and regional and national investment capital. And if you need to know what the gap between the rich and the poor in San Antonio in 1939, when this photograph was taken, 18 years after the flood, here it is. And what it suggests is the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, both in relational terms and in real terms. The flood helps us see the city at its core on race, on gender, on class, on environmental issues. Because the river by this time is fully concretized. None of the creeks were. The river is fundamentally controlled because of the dam. None of the creeks were. In the 20 years between the time of the flood and this photograph, some of the creeks at their confluence with the river were widened. And that's effectively all that happened. But that's not how this story ends. Had I ended it there, God, it would be depressing. And, you know, it doesn't have to be depressing. It shouldn't be depressing. And as it turns out, because of historical figures acting in a way that transformed the West Side, hence the title of the book, we have a different story to tell. Yes, it took 40 years for the telling of that story to begin to emerge, but the narrative emerges in two ways. The first of which is from the top down, by which I mean the election Representative Gonzalez in 1960. And his story is multiply important. He was born on the West Side. He watched floods rip through the West Side. And as a native son of that region and a politically ambitious guy, Gonzalez wanted to change the conditions under which his family and families like his had existed for decades. So when he ran for Congress, no one gave him a chance of winning. But what they didn't know is this guy was totally indefatigable. He just ran and ran and ran and effectively ran the conservative white critic opponent off the charts, out of the room. And suddenly there's Henry B. Gonzalez as the first Latino elected to the US Congress from San Antonio. And the whole of the city is his district at that point. Now the districts are much cut up and gerrymandered, as you know, in part because the city has grown and in part because the state legislature has done what it has done. But Gonzalez, almost immediately, once he gets to Washington, D.C., knows that he's got a bully pulpit. And he is very good at talking with the Appropriations Committee, getting money to come to San Antonio to begin the restoration of and the concretization of and the deepening of the West Side creeks. So if you look at those creeks today, they are not the creeks that were there in 1921. Those creeks basically ran maybe a foot, 2 feet below street level, which is why when they flashed into the community, they were running right into the community. They're now 30 feet, maybe even 40 feet in some cases, dug down to absorb water that would have come as it did in 21. So the creeks have been fundamentally physically changed. And that's hard to see when you're standing on one of those bridges, but it's important to know. So Gonzalez, for the next 30 years, used his position to build better streets, to build better creeks and the like, to do flood control, to build more parks. He used his position to help the West Side, but he's also the one person who looked at that dam and recognized that Olmos Dam was shaky, to say the least. And he got funding to tear that dam down and rebuild it in the starting in the late 1970s. It actually took place in the early 1980s, so that when I arrived in 81, the dam was just being recommissioned. That was much more solid. And it's really interesting to read the reports that were written about why this had to happen. They did not know about the critical 1921 reports, but they rebuilt the dam in exactly the way that those critical 21 reports said had to be rebuilt. So they didn't know about it, but it turns out they could see the problems as well as Gonzalez did. And he's the guy who got the money. I mean, he really understood what San Antonio collectively needed in a unified way, even as he poured an enormous amount of money was able to pour an enormous amount of money onto the West Side. But there's a second story, a second narrative about West Side Rising that is not so much federal to city as West Side to city. And it turns on communities organized for public services, probably then what would emerge to be one of the greatest, most powerful grassroots, and to my mind, environmental justice movements in the United States at the time. And COPS was formed, organized by Ernie Cortez, another West Side native, and who had been trained to think about organizing, not just as at a grassroots level, but that you needed to organize over a set of years before you do any action. Find out what people in the neighborhoods want. Don't presume, don't assume, ask. And for 2+ years, he interviewed every parish priest and asked them, who helps run the parish? I want to talk to them. Who has organizing skills? Who's webbed into the community? Those are the folks I want to talk to. He went to every of the few labor unions in San Antonio and said, who are the organizers? Those are the folks I want to talk to. He talked to teachers. He talked to parishioners. He talked to nonprofit organizations on the West Side and asked, okay, what are the felt needs? This is very much like what the Peace Corps does as well, by the way, that also came out of the same sort of ethos, which is ask communities what are their issues, not tell them what they are. Find out what those things are, and then figure out how you're going to transform those problems into prospects. And what Cortez heard time and time again, and he probably didn't need to because he grew up on the West Side, was drainage, drainage, drainage. Streets, streets, streets. Housing, housing, housing. Education, education, education. Those are still the issues on the West Side. The West Side zip codes remain the poorest zip codes in San Antonio and among the poorest in the nation. That should give us pause, because the story I'm going to tell you is an upbeat story, except those conditions, although they have relatively changed, have not changed relative to the rest of the city. And that's distressing. I can find you neighborhoods in Los Angeles for which that's the same thing, and in Chicago, in New York, in Boston. Name your big city, that's equally true. But what Cortez saw were opportunities. And he seized one in 1974 when a flood came barreling down Zarzamora Creek before it converged with Alazon Creek. It ripped through surrounding neighborhoods, swamped houses, flushed cars, destroyed bridges, did all of the things that floods always do in San Antonio. Except this time things changed because he'd been organizing. And the organizers of COPS decided that that flood was the perfect moment to raise its organizing community up to the public level. And they demanded that the city manager come to one of the high schools on the West Side and talk to them about floods. What the city manager didn't know is they didn't really want him to talk to them. They wanted to talk to him. And so he walks in, sits in the podium, and then endures what can only be called, I don't know, what's the word for it? He got destroyed. That audience did not let him talk because they were pissed off. And they basically said to him, look, we've been enduring floods since the 20s, if not 1819. There have been promises made that have not been redeemed. Yes, Henry B. Gonzalez is doing great work at the lower reaches of these creeks, but we just have experienced at the upper reaches of the Zarzamora which comes out of the medical center area roughly and sweeps into the west side from in that route. And they said, we want to talk to whoever is got power. And the city manager rightly said, you got to come to city council. And then they said, fine, put us on the agenda. Well, he put them on the agenda. They showed up, and this is a legendary story among organizers across the country, by the way. 500 people showed up in the tiny city council chambers. City council had never seen that many people in the chambers before. And they were not really interested in having city council talk to them. As the city manager discovered, so the council discovered. These people were angry and they had a lot to say, and they basically rhetorically did something absolutely brilliant. They told city council that they'd been looking at master plans and budgets dating back to the 1930s that had encumbered money to channelize all the West Side creeks, including the Zarzamora, that had never been spent. So they weren't just angry, they'd done their homework. And in doing their homework, they forced the city council to pause and go, is this true? They asked the city manager, he goes, yeah, it is true. And the mayor, Charlie Becker, to his credit, pivoted in his chair, looked at the city manager and said, you got 4 hours to find that money. This is like 8 o'clock at night. His staff immediately went to the budget, started scrounging around to find the dollars that had been encumbered, but had never been spent and had been spent elsewhere. And I tracked some of those monies in the book. 4 hours later, they showed back up at midnight, said, we've got the money and we'll put it into the hopper. Effectively, we're going to do the work that we said we were going to do, but have never done. In the next decade, from 74 to 84, cops wrangled $500 million in federal, state, and local funds to flow into the West Side that had been neglected since the beginning of the West Side as a place. For streets, for drainage, for the creeks, for better housing, all of the things that the survey of the West Side had demonstrated were felt needs, were crying needs. $500 million moved into this neighborhood and to the South Side, by the way, which they did not neglect because they had a lot of members in the South Side as well. It's kind of a remarkable story that then gets turned into a political transformation. Because no sooner had they started this process than they looked at the city charter and said, you know what? We have at-large election. That's actually illegal under the Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65. And if you look at the city council in 1974, it was all white but one person. It was being voted by those on the north side, by and large, who lived on the north side, were voting their own, and a city council whose interest was not on the west side, not on the south side, and not on the east side, but largely on building big roads and big parks on the north side, Olmos Park, Alamo Heights, and else, to their north, that were growing rapidly along the freeways, 281, along 410, and up and along to the east side and west side of I-10 as it crossed 410. So they formed a coalition with north side progressives and east side activists to change the city's charter from at-large to district elections. They didn't have to go to court. They challenged it and won elections in the city, changing the political structure of San Antonio for the last 40 plus years or so. It meant that Henry Cisneros could get elected to the city council and then become a 4-term mayor, the first Spanish surnamed mayor since the early 19th century. That also transformed. They cooperated with North Side environmentalists who were trying to defend what we now call as Government Canyon, to stop various kinds of developments in that aquifer area and to defend the aquifer. Henry B. Gonzalez wrote the first legislation for the Safe Water Drinking Act, framed around San Antonio. It became legislation that basically protected drinking water everywhere in the United States. I mean, the sort of bubbling activism in San Antonio is kind of amazing in the 1970s. And then cops did something really, really smart. They created what is, as this quote says, mini universities. Activists from all over the United States came to St. Mary's University, Our Lady of the Lake, and to activist camps that cops ran. University of Cops, as it was known. And then they returned to New York, to Chicago, to Miami, to Tucson, to Phoenix, to Los Angeles, to do what cops had done in San Antonio. So one way to think about what happened on the West Side is not just local, but was national in orientation. And San Antonio served for Mexican-American civil rights in the same way that Atlanta did for African-American civil rights. It was the catalyst, it was the incubus, it was the magnetic place that would transform political lives across the country because of a 1974 flood on the Zarzamora Creek. That's pretty incredible. And it means this story can have a sort of narrative relationship, because both Cortez and Gonzalez, they don't know who this girl is, and I don't know who she is. But they were thinking about that past as much as they were thinking about this present. This is a photograph down at Confluence Park where the San Pedro Creek and the river converge. If you haven't been down, you need to go. It's this beautiful landscape. But what I liked about the photo, all the photographs I saw was this one. These are kids from a West Side elementary school who have their hands on the watershed. They're not afraid of it because they don't have to be. There's a flood protection now that makes it possible for us to rethink this watershed and not turn our backs on it, but actually to open it up. And if you take a bike and ride along those extraordinary paths along the West Side Creek, along Martinez Creek, along Salado Creek, along the river, that's a direct consequence of West Side activism that demanded that the San Antonio River Authority, Sarah and others, start to convert what was just flood control into a recreational area. In short, for a climate denying city, this has been one of the high points, because it means that we are opening up the landscape, both as a landscape and also as a recreational zone for people to become healthier. To my mind, all of this last part of the story is a direct result of the 21 flood. And though it took time, it also suggests that the nature of hope is embedded in the activism of the community to better itself, to demand political change, and to the degree that's possible, achieve it. One last point. One of the ways to understand the flood of 21 is obviously read the book, buy multiple copies, 30 if need be, because like you've got friends. The other way is also to read the Spanish language reports that came out within a week of the flood and that appeared in a Spanish language newspaper in different forms, some in La Prensa and other parts elsewhere. And that as a consequence of writing this book, I came upon that documented, had it translated, had it transliterated, and Trinity Press has come out with an ebook, and I wish to God they would come out with the paperback, in which we've got now a bilingual edition that allows you to see how people on the ground responded to the flood at the time from the West Side. And the responses are both heroic, as you can imagine, of people who helped other people out of the flood. It talks about Cruz Azul and its work, and also talks about the inequities. And they're quite clear about the inequities. The river took away goods and services and furniture. The creeks killed people. And that was the gap that was startlingly clear in 21, and that it took until the 1970s and 80s for the larger city to recognize that it needed to change those conditions on the ground. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think we were all just spellbound listening to all of that. I'm so glad I've got my book so I can go back and I can look up certain facts that I didn't quite get. This is just such a story, and it ends a whole lot better than it started off. That's good to
Yeah,
hear.
that's true. Very true.
Does anybody have a question? I'm looking at the chat. And okay, what happened to that chat?
Okay, I just stopped the recording.
Oh, okay. So